A cardboard box sits abandoned in the underbrush of a lonely Pennsylvania road. Inside, wrapped in a cheap flannel blanket, lies the body of a small boy. His hair has been recently cut, the clippings still clinging to his bare skin. His eyes are closed. He appears to be sleeping, but he is not sleeping. He has been dead for days. And for the next 65 years, no one will know his name. This is the story of America's unknown child. A murder that haunted Philadelphia for over 6 decades. A victim so forgotten that even his identity became a mystery. And a truth that, when it finally emerged, raised more questions than it answered. Because knowing who he was only deepens the horror of what happened to him. On a cold February morning in 1957, a young college student named Frederick Benoni was driving along Susquehanna Road in the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia. He was checking his muskrat traps along a small creek that wound through the wooded area. The road was quiet, bordered by dense brush and scattered with the remnants of illegal dumping that plagued the outskirts of the city. Something caught his eye in the underbrush. A large cardboard box, partially hidden among the winter bare branches. At first, he assumed it was more trash. Perhaps old clothing or household items that someone had discarded. But something made him slow down. Something made him look closer. He did not stop. Not that day. Fear gripped him, an instinctive recognition that whatever lay in that box was not something he wanted to discover. He drove on, telling himself it was nothing. Telling himself he had imagined the pale shape he glimpsed through the cardboard. But he could not forget what he had seen. Days passed. The image haunted him. Finally, on February 25th, another man stumbled upon the same box. A young man named Frank Guthrum was walking through the same area, also checking animal traps. Unlike Benoni's, he approached the box. He pulled back the flaps, and what he found would change the course of Philadelphia history. Inside lay the naked body of a young boy. He was between 4 and 6 years old, with light brown hair and blue eyes. His small body showed signs of severe malnutrition. His bones protruded beneath paper-thin skin. But most disturbing were the marks that covered him. Bruises in various stages of healing, scars that told of repeated abuse, and recent injuries that suggested a violent end. The boy had been wrapped in a cheap plaid flannel blanket, the kind sold at any discount store. His hair had been crudely cut very recently, perhaps within hours of his death, as the clippings still clung to his body. Someone had tried to clean him before placing him in the box, but traces of his final moments remained visible on his skin. Guthrum ran to call the police. Within hours, the lonely stretch of Susquehanna Road was swarming with officers, detectives, and crime scene investigators. They had seen death before. They had investigated child murders. But something about this scene struck them as profoundly different. This child appeared to have come from nowhere, and no one was looking for him. The Philadelphia Police Department launched one of the most extensive investigations in the city's history. They printed over 400,000 flyers featuring a photograph of the boy, distributing them throughout the eastern United States. They contacted every hospital, orphanage, and social service agency they could find. They interviewed thousands of people. They chased down hundreds of leads. And they found nothing. The box itself was traced to a J.C. Penney store. It had once contained a bassinet, purchased sometime in the previous months. But the store had sold dozens of identical bassinets. Without receipts or records, the lead went cold. The flannel blanket was equally untraceable, a mass-produced item available at countless stores throughout the region. Medical examiners determined the boy had died from blunt force trauma to the head. He had been struck multiple times with tremendous force, but the injuries he bore extended far beyond that final assault. His body told a story of prolonged, systematic abuse. Old fractures that had healed improperly, scars that had formed over months or years. Malnutrition so severe that his growth had been significantly stunted. Whoever killed this boy had been hurting him for a very long time. The Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office made a crucial decision. They would not bury this child in an unmarked grave. They would preserve his remains, hoping that one day, someone would come forward to identify him. They also created a plaster death mask of his face, preserving his features for future investigators. But the months passed, and no one claimed him. No parents reported a missing child matching his description. No relatives came forward with information. No teachers or neighbors or doctors remembered treating a boy who fit his profile. It was as if he had never existed at all. In November of 1957, the boy was finally buried in a potter's field in Philadelphia. But the police refused to let his case die with him. They had given him a name of sorts. He became known as America's unknown child, and his photograph continued to circulate year after year as investigators hoped that someone, somewhere, would recognize him. The case attracted nationwide attention. Newspapers ran stories about the mysterious boy in the box. Television programs featured his photograph. Tips poured in from across the country. Each one was investigated. Each one led nowhere. One early theory focused on a foster home located less than 2 miles from where the body was discovered. Investigators learned that the home had housed multiple children during the period in question. They interviewed the residents extensively, but no evidence connected any of those children to the boy in the box. Another theory suggested the boy might have been the child of traveling carnival workers. The transient nature of carnival life might explain why no one had reported him missing. But extensive interviews with carnival communities produced no viable leads. A third theory pointed to the possibility that the boy had been brought to Philadelphia from elsewhere. Perhaps he had been killed in another state, and his body transported to the lonely road as a dumping ground. But without knowing where to look, investigators could not pursue this angle effectively. The frustration mounted with each passing year. Detectives who had worked the original case began to retire, passing the file to younger officers who approached it with fresh eyes, but the same dead ends. The boy in the box became more than a case. He became an obsession for the investigators who refused to let him be forgotten. In 1998, more than 40 years after the boy was discovered, the case received new attention. A national organization dedicated to identifying unknown victims took an interest in the Philadelphia mystery. Working with local police, they arranged for the boy's body to be exhumed. The exhumation served multiple purposes. First, investigators wanted to obtain DNA samples using modern techniques that had not existed in 1957. Second, they hoped to create a more accurate facial reconstruction using contemporary forensic methods. Third, they wanted to give the boy a proper burial in a marked grave. The exhumation was conducted with extraordinary care. The boy's remains, remarkably preserved after 4 decades in the ground, were examined by forensic anthropologists. They confirmed the original findings about his age and the trauma he had suffered. They extracted DNA samples, and they created a detailed dental record that might help with future identification. The boy was reburied in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. This time, he received a proper headstone. The inscription read, "America's unknown child." The grave became a pilgrimage site for those touched by his story. Strangers left flowers, toys, and notes for a child they had never known. But the DNA testing, which had seemed so promising, produced no matches. The databases of the late 1990s contained millions of profiles, but none of them belonged to anyone related to the boy in the box. The investigation entered a new phase in the 2000s. A woman named Martha came forward with an extraordinary claim. She said she recognized the boy. She said she knew exactly who he was and what had happened to him. And her story, if true, painted a picture of almost unimaginable horror. Martha, who used a pseudonym to protect her identity, claimed the boy had been purchased by her abusive mother from his biological parents. She said her mother had kept the child in the basement of their home, subjecting him to terrible abuse. She described how the boy had died during a meal when he vomited his food and was beaten to death in a rage. According to Martha, her mother had cut the boy's hair after his death, trying to disguise his appearance. She said she had been present when the body was placed in the box and abandoned on Susquehanna Road. She claimed the flannel blanket had come from their home. Investigators took Martha's claims seriously. They interviewed her multiple times, seeking details that could be verified. They examined property records, school records, and census data. They looked for any evidence that a child matching the boy's description had lived in Martha's home. They found nothing to support her account. The foster home Martha described was indeed located near the dump site, but there was no record of any child matching the boy's description living there. The timeline Martha provided contained inconsistencies that could not be resolved. And crucially, DNA testing of Martha and the boy showed no connection between them. Martha's story, while vivid and detailed, could not be verified. Some investigators believe she was genuinely trying to help, but had confused memories or psychological issues that led her to create a false narrative. Others suspected she was seeking attention. The truth remained elusive. The years continued to pass. New forensic techniques emerged. Each advancement brought renewed hope that the boy's identity might finally be discovered. Investigators tried isotope testing, which could reveal where a person had lived based on the chemical composition of their bones. The results suggested the boy had spent most of his life in the northeastern United States, but they could not pinpoint a specific location. Forensic genealogy, the technique that would revolutionize cold case investigations in the 2010s, eventually came to the boy's case. This method involved comparing DNA from unknown individuals to commercial genealogy databases, then building family trees to identify potential relatives. The process was painstaking. The boy's DNA was extracted and analyzed. Genetic genealogists began searching for matches, looking for distant cousins who might lead them to his parents. The search took years, following branches of family trees that often led nowhere. But slowly, carefully, a picture began to emerge. The genetic genealogists found matches. Not close relatives, but distant cousins separated by multiple generations. They began building family trees backwards, looking for common ancestors. Then they worked forward, identifying descendants who lived in the Philadelphia area in the 1950s. One family tree kept appearing in their results. A family with roots in the area. A family with a history that raised troubling questions. In December of 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department called a press conference. After 65 years, they announced the boy in the box had been identified. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was born on January 13, 1953, in Philadelphia. He had lived only 4 years before his death, and the story of his short life was even more tragic than investigators had imagined. Joseph was not a child who had slipped through the cracks of society. He had a birth certificate. He had been born in a hospital. He had parents whose names were on record. But somewhere between his birth and his death, he had become invisible. He had been hidden away, erased from the normal systems of documentation that should have protected him. The investigation revealed that Joseph's parents had given him away when he was very young. The circumstances of this transfer were murky, lost in the fog of decades past. But he had ended up in a situation of profound abuse, hidden from the eyes of neighbors, doctors, and authorities. The physical evidence supported this conclusion. Joseph's body showed years of malnutrition and abuse. Whoever had cared for him had not enrolled him in school, had not taken him to doctors, had not allowed him to exist in any of the normal ways that children exist in society. When he died, there was no one to report him missing, no one to ask where he had gone. His killers simply disposed of his body, expecting that he would remain unknown forever. For 65 years, they were right. The identification of Joseph Zarelli was a triumph of modern forensic science. But it immediately raised a devastating question. If investigators now knew who he was, could they identify who killed him? The Philadelphia Police Department announced that the investigation into Joseph's murder was ongoing. They had identified his parents. They had traced the path of his short life. But translating that knowledge into criminal charges proved extraordinarily difficult. The problem was time. 65 years had passed since Joseph's death. Many of the people who might have known what happened to him were themselves dead. Records from the 1950s were incomplete or had been destroyed. Memories had faded or been deliberately suppressed. Joseph's parents were both deceased by the time he was identified. His father had died years earlier. His mother had passed away more recently, taking whatever secrets she held to her grave. Investigators could not interview them, could not pressure them, could not offer plea deals in exchange for the truth. Other potential witnesses were equally unreachable. The people who had lived in Joseph's neighborhood in 1957 were elderly or dead. Those who might have seen something suspicious had long since forgotten or passed on. The passage of time, which had seemed like an obstacle to identification, now became an insurmountable barrier to justice. Investigators pieced together what they could about Joseph's family. His parents had been troubled individuals with histories that suggested dysfunction. They had other children, some of whom were still alive. These siblings were interviewed carefully, asked about memories that were more than 6 decades old. The interviews produced fragments of information, hints about the family's secrets, suggestions of abuse that extended beyond Joseph, but nothing concrete enough to build a criminal case. Some investigators believed they knew who had killed Joseph. The evidence pointed in certain directions, towards certain individuals, with a high degree of probability. But probability was not proof. and the standards for criminal conviction required certainty beyond reasonable doubt. The physical evidence from 1957 was limited. The original crime scene had been processed with the technology of the era, which was primitive by modern standards. Much of the potential evidence had been lost or degraded. The box and blanket had been destroyed long ago. Even the forensic evidence that remained was problematic. The injuries on Joseph's body pointed to abuse and murder, but they could not definitively identify the perpetrator. Multiple people might have had access to him. Multiple people might have participated in his mistreatment. Without witnesses who could testify, without confessions, without physical evidence linking a specific person to the fatal blows, prosecutors concluded they could not move forward with charges. The news that Joseph's killers would likely never face justice struck many as profoundly unfair. For 65 years, dedicated investigators had worked to solve this case. Volunteers had donated countless hours. Forensic scientists had applied cutting-edge technology. And in the end, they had achieved something remarkable. They had given the boy his name back. But they could not give him justice. The Philadelphia Police Department maintained that the investigation remained open. They encouraged anyone with information to come forward. They held out hope that somewhere, someone might have knowledge that could finally close the case. But privately, investigators acknowledged the grim reality. The killers were probably already dead. The witnesses were gone. The secrets had been buried with those who held them. Joseph Zarelli would have a proper grave with his real name. He would be remembered as a person, not just as a case number. But his murderers would never answer for what they did to him. The story of Joseph Zarelli forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how children can be made invisible in our society. In 1957, there were no Amber Alerts. There were no mandatory reporting laws for child abuse. There were no databases connecting schools, hospitals, and social services. A child could simply disappear. Joseph's birth was documented. But after that, he vanished from all records. No school enrollment, no medical visits, no census entries. By the time his body was found, there was no paper trail leading back to his identity. The systems that should have protected him either did not exist or had failed completely. And the people responsible for his death exploited these gaps with horrifying success. In the decades since Joseph's death, significant reforms have been implemented. Child protective services became more robust. Reporting requirements were strengthened. Schools became more vigilant about tracking students. Hospital staff were trained to recognize and report signs of abuse. But children still fall through the cracks. Children still suffer in silence. Children still die, and sometimes they still remain unidentified. The identification of Joseph Zarelli was made possible by a revolution in forensic genealogy. This technique, which emerged in the 2010s, has transformed cold case investigations. By comparing DNA from unknown individuals to commercial genealogy databases, investigators can identify distant relatives and work backward to identify victims and perpetrators. The method is not without controversy. Privacy advocates worry about the implications of law enforcement accessing genealogy databases. Some argue that people who submit their DNA for ancestry research do not consent to having it used in criminal investigations. But for the families of victims, the technique has been transformative. Cases that seemed permanently cold have been solved. Victims who had been forgotten have been identified. Killers who thought they had escaped justice have been caught. In Joseph's case, the genetic genealogy process took years. Investigators had to build extensive family trees, eliminating branches that did not fit, following leads that often went nowhere. The work required patience, expertise, and significant resources. But in the end, it worked. A boy who had been unknown for 65 years finally had his name. The question of why no one reported Joseph missing haunts investigators to this day. His parents knew he existed. His siblings knew. Neighbors might have seen him at some point. Someone must have noticed when he disappeared. Yet no one spoke up. No one called the police. No one questioned where the small boy had gone. The most likely explanation is also the most disturbing. Joseph was hidden so effectively that few people even knew he existed. He was kept isolated, away from the normal interactions that might have revealed his presence. When he died, there was no one outside his immediate circle who would have noticed his absence. This level of concealment suggests a deliberate, prolonged effort to hide the child from society. It suggests that those responsible knew their treatment of Joseph was criminal and took steps to prevent detection. It suggests a calculated cruelty that extended far beyond the violence of his death. Joseph was not just murdered, he was erased. And the people who erased him spent decades believing they had succeeded. Today, Joseph Zarelli lies in Ivy Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia. His grave, once marked simply as America's unknown child, has been updated to bear his true name. Visitors still come to pay their respects, though now they can speak his name when they do. The Philadelphia Police Department considers the case technically open. They continue to accept tips and information. But the detectives who work the case acknowledge that the chances of criminal charges are effectively zero. The perpetrators are beyond the reach of earthly justice. For the investigators who dedicated years or even decades to solving this case, the identification brought a sense of bittersweet accomplishment. They had answered the central question that had driven them. Who was this boy? But they had been unable to deliver the full justice that Joseph deserved. The case remains a reminder of both the power and limitations of modern forensic science. Technology that did not exist in 1957 ultimately identified the victim. But technology cannot resurrect the dead, cannot force confessions from graves, cannot undo the passage of 65 years. Joseph Zarelli was 4 years old when he died. He never started school. He never learned to read. He never experienced the normal joys of childhood. His entire existence was marked by suffering, culminating in a brutal death at the hands of those who should have protected him. For 65 years, he was known only by the circumstances of his discovery. The boy in the box, America's unknown child, a symbol of failure and mystery and the limits of justice. Now he has his name back. Joseph Augustus Zarelli, a real person with a real identity, finally acknowledged by the society that failed to protect him. But his killers died without consequence. They lived full lives after taking his. They kept their secret until their own deaths, never facing the judgment they deserved. The box is gone. The blanket is gone. The evidence has degraded beyond usefulness. What remains is a name on a headstone, a file that will never be formally closed, and the knowledge that somewhere beneath the soil of Philadelphia, the bones of a murdered child finally rest under his true identity. This is how some stories end. Not with justice, not with closure, but with the simple, powerful act of refusing to forget. Joseph Zarelli was here. He mattered. And even if his killers escaped punishment, his name will endure. For every child whose story ends in tragedy, there are others still waiting to be found. Other boxes and other brushes along other lonely roads. Other names that have been lost. Other identities that have been erased. Other victims who remain unknown. The work continues. The investigators keep searching. And somewhere, in files and databases and the memories of those who will not give up, the next discovery waits. Because every child deserves a name. And every name deserves to be spoken. Cases like this are still waiting to be solved. Subscribe for more true crime stories that refuse to be forgotten.